Everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today to present some insights from the project that we have been carrying out at the IEA Energy Efficiency Division in the context of the behavioral insights platform of the Users TCP. So my presentation is organized in 3 parts. First of all, I will be starting out discussing what are behavioral insights and how can they support the energy policy process. Why should energy policy and utility practitioners be interested in insights from behavioral sciences? Secondly, I will move into a discussion of some examples of behavioral insights applications, some case studies, looking at how behavioral insights have been used to encourage energy efficiency in 3 sectors, in residential building and appliances, in transport and mobility, and in business operations. And finally, I will conclude by providing some broader takeaways from case study analysis. So to begin with, what are we talking about when we talk about behavioral insights, or in short, BIs? We're talking about insights, in fact, from multiple disciplines, from behavioral sciences, neurosciences, psychology, behavioral economics. And to simplify a bit the types of questions that these disciplines try to answer, look at what are the drivers of individual behavior on one hand, and how can policy support desirable behavior change. So in the energy context, then these questions translate into trying to understand what are the behavioral mechanisms that affect energy consumption and the decisions that have implications for energy consumption, and then trying to understand what are the behavioral barriers that prevent flexible and efficient energy use, the barriers to investment in energy efficient renovations and renewable energy, and the barriers that block the uptake of sustainable mobility. And so, of course, we acknowledge that there may be structural or budget constraints and barriers to the uptake of all these types of desirable behaviors that align with energy efficiency objectives. But here we are focusing on behavioral mechanisms and trying to understand the role that behavioral insights can have in addressing them. So how is it then that the behavioral insights can support the energy policy process? First of all, as I said, by identifying behavioral mechanisms that act as barriers to behavior change. And so some examples could be the lack of feedback on our energy consumption. So think about our day-to-day consumption activities at home, turning on a lamp or an electric appliance. Consumers do not necessarily have, unless they are particularly tech savvy, they have a smart meter and know how to use it and how to interpret information. They may not have immediate feedback on their energy consumption, and they may not be sure on how to interpret it. So that's one feature of the functioning of energy consumption that leads to this type of behavioral barriers to deliberate efforts to save energy. Secondly, we have choices such as investment in energy efficiency, such as more energy efficient appliances or home retrofits, or purchasing a more fuel efficient vehicle, that have clear upfront investment costs, but that in fact deliver benefits in terms of lower energy consumption, so higher energy savings and lower energy bills as a stream of benefits into the future. And so this type of feature here makes it complicated for consumers to figure out the math and understand the pros and cons of these types of investment, acting as an investment barrier on top, of course, of budget constraints that we know exist. Further, this type of choices are relatively infrequent since we do not change appliances and cars every so often, and these can also limit learning patterns that consumers might benefit when they more frequently interact with this type of decision on the market. And finally, some of the day-to-day activities that have large energy implications, such as our travel choices, are ingrained in routine behaviors, and so they might be more complex to change. So understanding what are these behavioral mechanisms can then help policymakers and utilities understand which are the right behavioral levers to pick in order to address them. And here I've just mentioned 3 examples: behavioral mechanisms, simplification and framing of information, and the use of social norms and comparisons. But as we go through case studies, I will be telling you how specifically these types of levers have been applied concretely to actual policy questions. So what we have been doing in the course of this project is an analysis of over 40 case studies in terms of behavioral insights applications to both policy and programs across 3 sectors. As I said, residential buildings and appliances, transport and mobility, and businesses and other organizations. So within the context of residential buildings and appliances, we see that most of the behavioral interventions that we have been able to analyze through our environment scan effort try to promote lower energy consumption in residential buildings, and others try instead to promote investment efforts in the purchase of energy efficient appliances or retrofits, as well as investment in renewable energy installation among residential users. Secondly, if we look at behavioral insights applications to the transport and mobility sector, we see that the key policy questions to which these insights have been applied are how to support the purchase of fuel efficient vehicles and particularly electric vehicles, how to encourage walking, cycling and public transport use, and how to limit the use of private motorized vehicles. Finally, we observe a third area of applications of behavioral insights in the context of business behavior and organizational behavior. So trying to affect the behavior of businesses as a whole, trying to encourage energy saving efforts of these organizations, but also trying to encourage individual behavior of employees in their workplace environment, since the behavioral mechanisms there might vary with respect to those that affect our behavior at home. So which are the institutions that have been concretely leveraging behavioral insights to develop behavioral informed interventions in the context of energy policies and programs? We see that most interventions have been initiated by central government institutions. So here we are mainly talking about energy ministries, energy departments, sometimes also environment ministries, generally in cooperation with behavioral insights teams, which are groups of experts nested in public institutions. In some countries, we have such units directly nested within the energy ministry, for example, so working specifically on energy related questions, whereas in others, behavioral insights teams are teams of cross-sectoral experts which work, let's say, in the office of the Prime Minister and support the activities of various ministries according to needs. Another type of cooperation that we have seen is that between central government and academics working specifically on behavioral insights and energy-related questions. The second broad category of behavioral interventions is the one that involves utilities as the institution in charge of this type of intervention. And utilities have really been working hand in hand with specialized businesses, designing digital systems, but also communication channels to provide more effective, more timely information to consumers when it comes to feedback on their energy consumption. And finally, it's worth noting that in the context of transport-related interventions, local governments have been playing a larger role, given that context specificities in terms of barriers to sustainable mobility are obviously very important. Where is it that we observe energy-related behavioral insights applications? So the case studies that we have been analyzing in our work, which we have gathered both through desk research and through a survey that we have widely circulated and followed up with interviews. As you can see, the case studies that we've gathered are mainly concentrated in English-speaking countries, in Canada, the UK, but also the US, Australia. But at the same time, we've also seen increasing activities in Japan, in the Netherlands, in Ireland, and other European countries. It's worth noting that behavioral insights have also been informing concrete policy reform in an emerging economy, large emerging economy like India, but they can also be applied to better understanding the barriers to the uptake of energy efficient appliances in Uganda, as has been the case of research looking at the barriers to the uptake of efficient cook stoves, for example. So when we look at the results of behavioral insights interventions, it's important to understand to what extent are results context specific, to what extent are they affected by the local policy environment, and on the other hand, which of these insights are likely to be applicable across countries, or at least worth testing in a different context to better understand how they would play out. So let me then move into the second part of my presentation and share with you some concrete examples of behavioral insights applications. So first of all, let's look at how feedback provision has been used in the context of behavioral insights application. The first example is that of monthly home energy reports, which are by now a well-established practice in utility operations. And these are reports that utilities send to their customers, including not only historical information on energy consumption, but also a social comparison. So a comparison of one's own energy consumption with respect to the average household with a similar composition in the same area. So what this type of social comparison does is leverage the wish of individuals to align with social norms, so prompting a reduction in energy consumption if one finds out that it's over-consuming with respect to his peers. And the interesting thing, if we look at outcomes from the implementation of home energy reports, is that they have been implemented across multiple countries, and the results of which we are aware all point towards significant reductions in energy consumption as a consequence of receiving this type of monthly feedback tool, about 2%, both in Japan, Malaysia, and in the US, but up to 6% when we look at their impact for high-consuming households in the US, for example. Another way in which feedback provision can be used as a tool to better engage consumers and make them more aware of their energy consumption patterns, motivating efforts for energy savings, is that of real-time feedback through smart digital devices. A number of countries are investing in the rollout of smart meters. The UK is going towards rollout across the whole country by the end of 2020. And in this context, there have been a number of pilots looking at the impacts of smart meters coupled with other devices that can make energy consumption patterns more visible to consumers, such as in-home displays, similar to the one you see pictured there. And results from trials looking at the impact of smart meters and in-home displays point to their positive impact in prompting energy savings and in reducing energy consumption both for gas and for electricity. Similarly, this type of pilot program has been run in order to test the impact of smart thermostats, again in the UK, and it's been shown that they can deliver also even larger reductions in gas consumption without loss of thermal comfort, which is of course fundamental in order to motivate consumers to engage with this type of tool and to improve their energy consumption without diminishing their comfort. So the bottom line from this type of intervention here is that the novelty is not necessarily in the digital tool or the report itself. The novelty is in leveraging the big data conveyed by smart meters to provide detailed feedback through well-designed and intuitive tools. So the key here is really to use behavioral insights in the design of feedback provision tools in order to prompt consumers to take action to save energy. Let's look at a second type of behavioral intervention. And we have examples here of how goal setting and prompts have been used by energy utilities in the context of demand response programs and more broadly consumer engagement programs. Here we see an example from Australia where Jemena Electricity Network has been inviting consumers to take part in demand response challenges, which last only 3 hours, generally on very hot days in order to control peak demand in this type of event. And so consumers are invited to reduce their energy consumption in exchange for small rewards, such as vouchers in affiliated shops. And this type of well-targeted effort has delivered electricity consumption reductions by 25 to up to 42%. At the same time, this type of prompt for consumption reduction, inviting consumers to take action, has also been leveraged by utilities on longer time horizons. So in Canada, for example, BC Hydro has been inviting consumers to take part in year-long challenges to curb their consumption by 10% in order to obtain a substantial reduction on their energy bill. And what has been found is that this type of challenge, which is interspaced with a number of tips to consumers in order to encourage them to achieve this type of objective, through this type of engagement, consumers end up generally overshooting the objective, so achieving a higher than 10% reduction in their power consumption. So what we see here is that energy utilities can use higher levels of customer engagement also through gamification. So higher levels with respect to sending a monthly home energy report, for example, or installing smart meters and smart devices by inviting consumers to set precise goals of energy savings and regularly prompting consumers to engage with this type of objective and providing tips on how to get there. And this is particularly important at peak time. Let's look at the third example. And here we are looking at how behavioral insights can support investment in energy efficient goods rather than looking at how, as in the past two cases, how they can be used to encourage energy savings in everyday life. So here we are looking at how behavioral insights can inform the redesign of energy efficiency labels, which are a very well-established policy tool when it comes to supporting energy efficient investment decisions. And what we see is that behavioral insights have in fact already informed large-scale policy reforms of this type of tool. In fact, the EU redesign of energy efficiency labels for appliances, which has shifted to an A to G scale, like the one you can see in the picture there, has been informed by a number of experiments and trials involving consumers from across multiple European countries in order to test the understanding of consumers of different label designs and understand which of those appear to be the most intuitive, the most easily understood, and the ones that helped consumers pick the most efficient goods. So this, as you can see, is one application of behavioral insights that has translated into large-scale policy intervention. Another example is that of US fuel economy labels, which have integrated insights from the behavioral science literature, including information on fuel costs, as well as savings with respect to the average new vehicle in the same category, and adding an indicator of gallons per mile alongside the miles per gallon traditional indicator. So all these additional pieces of information basically help the consumer do the math for this type of complex intertemporal consumption decision. So what we see here, again, the novelty is not in the information provision tool itself. Energy and fuel efficiency labels have been around for quite a while, but the idea is to leverage as much as we can the insights we have about how information provision can be made most effective by framing it in an intuitive way, simplifying information as much as possible in order to improve consumer understanding and make sure that it really translates into a useful tool to guide consumption decision. Let's then move to travel-related behavioral insights applications. So here, I'm going to give you an example of how travel planning has been adopted as a large-scale policy measure in the context of the Sustainable Travel Towns initiative in the UK. So this was an initiative which involved 3 middle-sized towns lasting several years and involving substantial investments in mainstreaming so-called soft transport policy measures, as opposed to, let's say, infrastructural transport investment. And the measures implemented involved personalized travel planning, but also workplace and school travel planning, as well as awareness campaigns and promotion of walking, cycling, and public transport. And the contribution of all these measures as a whole, in fact, has resulted into a reduction in car driver trips per person and in an important increase in the use of public transport, increasing bus trips by up to 22%, but also in increases in the use of zero carbon options, such as cycling and walking. Another example of how travel planning can be used alongside gamification to support sustainable mobility comes from Australia. It's a more recent example, and it shows how a specific segment of the population can be targeted with tailored policy measures in this case. So this initiative targeted school kids, in primary school kids more specifically, and it provided travel planning tools to parents, as well as worksheets to plan daily commutes, and engaged with kids through games and other community activities in order to leverage social norms and social comparisons, making these a sort of community effort to shift to active mobility rather than an individual or household effort only. And this type of double initiative managed to increase active mobility in daily commutes to school by 34%. So what we see looking at these two types of interventions is that, of course, structural barriers to sustainable mobility need to be addressed with appropriate policy interventions that they might require an assessment of the infrastructural context that affects travel decisions. But this type of behaviourally informed, so-called soft transport policy measures can help overcome some behavioral barriers and have been shown to boost walking and cycling. Let me then provide as a final example of behavioral insights application, one in the context of business behavior. So we've seen a couple of behavioral interventions which use behavioral insights to increase the relevance of energy efficiency for businesses. One example comes from the Netherlands, where a workshop was put in place by the Netherlands Enterprise Agency to engage energy managers in an exercise not only on how to calculate benefits of energy efficiency investment, but also in understanding how to better communicate this type of benefits to top management. So this type of workshop resulted in efforts to translate benefits into business key performance indicators. So going beyond the usual metrics such as energy savings and reductions in energy bills, and trying to help top management visualize how this type of investment can positively affect business operations as a whole. Another way in which behavioral insights have informed this time an actual change in regulation in the UK is by trying to increase the profile of energy audits. So trying to increase the profile and the awareness of board level directors in terms of the information contained in energy audits. So now, due to this new regulatory requirement in the UK, results of energy audits need to be signed off by at least 2 board level directors, and survey evidence after the implementation of this requirement shows that the average priority placed on energy efficiency at board level has increased after the introduction of this new rule. Of course, for both of these types of interventions, what we see here is a positive impact on awareness of managers in terms of improved understanding of the potential of energy efficiency investment. Now, the next step is, of course, to try and understand to what extent this type of interventions translate into actual investments. Let me then shift to the third and final part of my presentation, sort of taking a step back and trying to discuss some broader takeaways from case study analysis. So as I said, I've presented here a subset of case studies, but in the whole of the project, we look at more than 40 behavioral insights applications. And in terms of the scale of implementation of these types of interventions, we see that in terms of policies, most policy applications that we observe are pilots, whereas in terms of utility programs, behavioral interventions have actually been rolled out at full scale, and they have become a more well-established, let's say, part of operations of energy utilities. So the first takeaway here is that there needs to be a shift from pilot projects to full-scale policies when, of course, trials of such behavioral interventions do prove successful and robust. The second type of takeaway is that we see, in terms of the level at which these types of interventions are implemented, what we observe is that most of the action is taking place at national level. What we also observe several successful interventions at state level, for example, in federal countries, but also local level, particularly when it comes to transport related interventions. There is also potential for business level or business sectoral level applications. Another type of general consideration that we can make looking at action in terms of behavioral insights overall, what we observe is that the toolkit of behavioral levers is not fully exploited yet. So what we see is that most interventions have been exploiting simplification and framing of information, whereas levers that appear to be very promising, such as the use of feedback mechanisms or the use of social norms and comparisons, are relatively less exploited. So there is certainly room to boost the impact of these types of interventions by building upon multiple levers as required and as appropriate. Another important thing to note is that while we have, I have given examples of, let's say, behavioral informed interventions that are relatively innovative, we can also see how behavioral insights can enhance the impacts of so-called traditional energy policies, from energy efficiency labels that I've already discussed, to economic incentives that can more or less directly contribute also to energy savings and to supporting energy efficient investment. One example is that of exploiting behavioral insights in the design of congestion pricing schemes in urban environment. This has been the case, for example, in London, where behavioral insights were used to design both the congestion pricing mechanism itself as well as the communication campaign surrounding it to increase its impact and acceptability. Another example is the use of behavioral insights in order to increase the visibility and the response to dynamic energy pricing. Behavioral insights can also help explain why is it that consumers react in a stronger way to critical peak pricing as opposed to rebates associated with energy savings effort in the context of critical peak. And another example of concrete policy reform in which behavioral insights have informed change of well-established policies is that of India, where product specifications and standards for air conditioners have been enriched with a smart default. So as of January of this year, new room air conditioners in India have to respect a default set point temperature of 24 degrees in order to build in a more efficient default option basically for appliances from the point of sale, while of course still allowing consumers to tweak it as they please. Let me then conclude with some general considerations and sort of open questions or areas for further work. So as I mentioned previously, most of the policy applications that we have been analyzing are actually still at trial stage. So what's important is to understand which of these trials should be mainstreamed and upscale to full-scale policies, and understand which of these insights, as I said, can be generalized to a greater set of countries and motivate additional experimentation in different countries. A second area of further work and greater potential, certainly for the application of behavioral insights, is that while we see most interventions focus on households and individuals, there is certainly room for larger application of behavioral insights to organization and business behavior. So to understand what are the behavioral barriers to the perception of, for example, energy efficient investment as relevant in certain business sectors. If we look at then sector-specific takeaways, looking at residential buildings and appliances, we see that in terms of programs aimed at changing habits, prompting energy saving efforts, there is the possibility likely to scale up and to mainstream some successful programs, such as the feedback mechanisms discussed earlier on in this presentation. But an element that needs to be embedded in this type of program is an effort to ensure persistency of energy saving efforts. And for this, there need to be then efforts to make sure that consumers are continuously engaged rather than sort of forgetting about this type of tools and thus reducing the impact of this type of efforts in the longer term. When it comes to prompting investment, the challenge is certainly larger in the sense that there have been efforts, for example, looking at how to leverage social norms in order to encourage people to take up home retrofits. For example, in Ireland, very interesting types of interventions have been already tested in this context. But more work needs to be done to better understand what are the barriers to large-scale investment, and certainly the potential of social norms can be further explored, looking at how, for example, community investment schemes could be adopted in order to boost investment in retrofits and renewable energy adoption. In the context of transport and mobility, we've seen a couple of examples of case studies. And I think one of the key takeaways here is to boost the adoption of context-specific interventions that should be based on local behavioral diagnostics to understand what is the relative importance of behavioral barriers as opposed to structural or infrastructural barriers to the uptake of sustainable mobility. And according to that, then the appropriate behavioral levers can be put in place. Finally, in terms of energy efficiency in businesses, what the intervention that I've discussed here point to is the importance of building sector-specific narratives for energy efficiency, building upon key performance indicators that speak to business managers, potentially more than energy savings and reduction in energy bills. So I will be stopping here for now, and I look forward to your questions and comments.